two bankers, one Jewish American and one Japanese, met in 1904, and their goal was to take down the entire Russian Empire. And just 18 months later, Russia had actually surrendered, Japan had won, and that Jewish banker, well, he got his sweet retribution. This isn't just a story about war. It's about finance, how loans, bonds, and quiet power reshaped the course of history. This is a story of how two bankers changed Russia and Japan forever. Our story begins in 1904. There was no warning, no formal declaration of war. The Japanese admiral ordered his fleet to launch a surprise attack on the Russian squadron at Port Arthur. The assault crippled several Russian ships and trapped the rest inside the harbor. Japan had placed Port Arthur under naval blockade, denying any Russian Pacific fleet the freedom to maneuver. Japan didn't waste a second taking full control of the sea. You see, they studied their enemy. They knew that the longer the delay, the more it risked being overwhelmed by Russia's sheer numbers. If reinforcements from the west arrived, it could prevent any landing from succeeding. So, by March, they had already begun landing troops on mainland Asia. The First Army moved swiftly and in secret as it crossed from Japan to the Korean peninsula. The plan was clear: advance north through Korea into Russia-held Manchuria, and then fight fiercely and win at all costs. The first land battle soon followed. After days of bloody and bitter fighting, the Japanese forces beat the Russians. And this marked more than just a battlefield between two military powers. It was the first time in generations that an Asian power had defeated a European one in modern warfare. But you see, this was just the beginning, because both nations now mobilized their full strength. The war would not be quick. Each side prepared for a long and costly struggle that would decide control of East Asia. The Japanese dug in and fortified their positions, and meanwhile, the Russians were constrained by logistical nightmares. The single-track Trans-Siberian Railway was the only means of transporting troops and supplies to its far east. But eventually they would arrive, and Japan couldn't afford to lose its window of opportunity, and they had to act immediately. Now, while much has been written about the tactics and battles of the Russo-Japanese War, it was finance that ultimately shaped its outcome. You see, behind the scenes, Japan's ability to wage war depended not just on its armies or fleets, it depended on its financial systems. At the center of that system stood the Bank of Japan. The Bank of Japan had already played a key role in Japan's rapid modernization. In just a few decades, it helped the country transform from a feudal aristocracy to an industrial powerhouse. Though officially a private institution, it operated under government control. In 1883, it was granted a monopoly over the country's money supply. Its structure and rules were modeled on British banking practices. In 1885, it issued Japan's first national banknotes, and just 2 years later, Japan adopted the gold standard. Now, this was a rapid transformation, and it allowed Japanese financial transactions to be recognized globally and enabled the country to borrow money from international markets. These reforms laid the groundwork for Japan to finance a modern war. Without strong monetary control and access to global credit, Japan's campaigns across the land and the sea would have faltered. But in this war, the Bank of Japan would have the chance to show its true power. And the person leading the charge was none other than Takahashi Korekiyo, one of Japan's most accomplished financial minds at the time. Japan's war was going well militarily, but financially it was hanging on by a thread. Takahashi was touring the world looking to finance this war in any way he could, but all he found were closed doors. You see, from a very young age, Takahashi Korekiyo had prepared himself for success. He studied English extensively and even spent time in the United States to improve his fluency. His early career spanned a wide range of financial institutions. He worked for the banks in London, India, and China, and even held roles in Japan's Ministry of Finance and Education. At one point, he left Japan entirely to manage a silver mining venture in Peru. Now, that project ultimately failed, but the setback wasn't on his mind for long because his government wanted him back to serve as the Bank of Japan's vice president. It was in this role that he was sent to do a critical task: to secure financial backing for Japan's expanding military budget. And once the war with Russia began, he was laser focused on making sure they could afford to fight it. His mission saw him travel to the Secretary first to the United States and then to Britain. He was determined to secure foreign loans to keep Japan's war machine running. However, his requests for funding were always falling on deaf ears. He struggled to convince banks to back Japan, and with no clear success, he prepared to return home. That was until he stumbled upon Jacob Schiff. You see, Schiff had been one of the most influential bankers in the world. He was the head of Kuhn, Loeb & Co., a major American investment firm, and he had immense sway over international finance. Now, the two men had met in April 1904 at an official dinner in London. You see, Takahashi was candid and frustrated when he was speaking to Schiff about his fears. Without a loan, Japan's war could stall. Now, Schiff listened to Takahashi very carefully. But you see, Jacob Schiff had his own reasons to care. Schiff had personally despised the Russian Emperor Nicholas Tsar II. You see, just a year earlier, Russia had seen a wave of violent anti-Jewish pogroms. The most infamous of these was in Kishinev. These state-tolerated massacres forced thousands of Jewish people to flee the Russian Empire. Schiff himself was Jewish, and he had watched the suffering of his people with deep anger. He saw in Japan more than just a business opportunity. He saw his chance for revenge. So, Schiff agreed to help, and he would eventually become one of Japan's most important financial allies. His name would unlock capital Japan needed from American and European markets. Working through his firm, Kuhn, Loeb & Co., Schiff helped Japan raise an astonishing $200 million in loans from American markets in 1904. At the time, this was an incredible sum of money. Today, that would be worth billions and billions of dollars. The size shocked the global financial community. I mean, the loan covered half of Japan's total war expenses. It was also the first major Wall Street loan ever extended to Japan. Beyond investing his own capital, Schiff also persuaded powerful allies on Wall Street to join in. This included big names such as the First National Bank and the National City Bank. Jacob Schiff's credibility had opened doors that were closed to Takahashi just even a few weeks earlier. He urged Takahashi to tell his government to double down the war effort and not to worry about the money. Personally, he had hoped that a Japanese victory would permanently weaken or even destroy the Tsarist regime. Now, on the other side of the world, the war was in full swing. Thanks to the sudden influx of foreign capital, Japan's military could now expand its operation with speed and scale. In May of 1904, the Second Army landed on the Kwantung Peninsula. The force vastly outnumbered the Russians stationed to defend the narrow corridor. They stormed the fortified Russian positions and secured a major victory at the Battle of Nanshan. The win cut off Port Arthur from the rest of the Russian forces in Manchuria. Around the same time, two more Japanese divisions landed on the eastern coast of Korea, forming the Third Army. They marched southward with orders to capture Port Arthur. The other division soon followed, forming the Fourth Army. It landed further up the Manchurian coast to press the advantage. Now the Japanese had aimed to coordinate a multi-pronged assault with overwhelming manpower and momentum. And by late May, the vastly larger Japanese force circled Port Arthur. This siege would become a very significant moment in the war. You see, while Japan surged ahead with the new funding and military gains, Russia was struggling under the weight of financial exhaustion. Even before the war began, the empire's economy had been in trouble. By the end of 1902, Russia's balanced budget had already begun to collapse. The tax system was already stretched to its limit, and the treasury faced a pretty deep crisis. When the war came, Russia had very few options. They could either print money and risk inflation or turn to foreign markets for loans on high interest. I mean, neither seemed feasible. As the conflict dragged on, Russia's military setbacks mirrored its financial ones. In 1905, Port Arthur finally lost after a long and costly siege. However, despite this loss, Russian reinforcements had arrived in full strength. The Russian army regrouped for a massive counteroffensive. It would be at Mukden that the final and largest battle of the war would commence. There, three Russian armies consisting of 330,000 men with over 1,500 guns faced off against three Japanese armies totaling only 270,000 men and just over 1,000 guns. But despite these numbers, the Japanese pushed forward, and the city of Mukden fell to Japan. This occurred just as Japan had already won a stunning victory at sea. The Japanese Navy destroyed most of Russia's Baltic fleet in a single engagement. I mean, this defeat on both land and sea was devastating to Russia. At home, unrest was growing even more. protests and strikes spread across Russian cities. The Tsar faced immense pressure from all sides. I mean, Japan had won decisively. The Tsar had no option but to settle for peace. The war had officially ended with the Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1905, just 18 months after that fateful meeting between Jacob Schiff and Takahashi. Japan emerged as the clear victor. It gained control of the Liaodong Peninsula and the strategically vital Port Arthur. But not only that, they also gained a huge economic asset, and that was the South Manchurian Railway, which connected the region to deeper parts of Asia. As an added bonus, Japan took the southern half of the Sakhalin Island. Russia agreed to withdraw from southern Manchuria. That was later returned to China. But most critically of all, Japan's control over Korea was now formally recognized, a major step in its grander ambition towards becoming an imperial power. The treaty had been brokered in the United States. President Theodore Roosevelt played a key diplomatic role. He would later be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for the peace he brokered, the first American to receive this kind of honor. The war would mark a turning point in the global balance of power. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had not only stood toe-to-toe with a European empire, but actually defeated it. A new era in which the East could challenge the West on equal footing had begun. Japan's victory over Russia alarmed the world. It signaled that the West had now taken Japan seriously. With this win, it had secured its place amongst great powers. And this is all thanks to the quiet work of financiers with the ability to move more money than the GDP of some nations. And amongst these bankers, none stood taller than Jacob Schiff. His role in securing critical war loans for Japan made headlines across the world. In recognition for his contribution, Schiff was invited to Japan, and the emperor personally received him, an honor rarely granted to foreigners. He became the first non-Japanese person in history to be awarded the Order of the Rising Sun. But this wasn't the end of his involvement in this saga. You see, Russia's defeat in the war had triggered massive unrest back at home. The humiliation of losing to an Asian power shattered public confidence in their emperor. Discontent had already been brewing over economic inequality, political repression, and widespread poverty. This defeat was the spark that ignited a power keg. You see, a revolution had followed. Thousands died in bloody crackdowns and street battles. The Tsar was forced to make limited reforms, but it wasn't enough to save the monarchy in the long run. The cracks in the Tsarist systems were permanent. 10 years later, the World War followed, and everyone learned the wrong lessons from this war. Russia wouldn't even survive the war, and the cracks would break wide open in the October Revolution of 1917. Allegedly, it is here again that we find Jacob Schiff's shadow. His name had already been whispered in political circles, now as a force behind Russia's unraveling. It became widely believed that Schiff helped fund the Russian revolutionaries. So when the February Revolution of 1917 finally toppled the Romanovs, Schiff saw that as long-awaited justice. And just months later, the Bolsheviks would seize control and plunge Russia into a civil war that killed millions. Tsar Nicholas II would himself meet a brutal end where he and his family were executed by Bolshevik forces. Apparently, Jacob Schiff had allegedly helped the communists seize power by giving them to the tune of $20 million for the triumph of Bolshevism in Russia. As for Takahashi Korekiyo, his role in the war would not even be the highlight of his legacy. He would become the 7th president of the Bank of Japan, and just 2 years later, he would step up to be Japan's Minister of Finance, an office that he would hold 6 times. And in 1921, he was elected Prime Minister for the country. I mean, Takahashi would play a pivotal role in shaping Japan's economic modernization. His bold and unorthodox policies would later go on to help the nation to quickly recover from the Great Depression. Amongst economic circles, his approach to public spending and monetary easing had earned him a reputation as Keynes before Keynes. Now, Takahashi's legacy would end with some tragedy. His outspoken resistance to Japanese imperialism abroad and refusal to bow to the military's demands would make him a pretty big target. In February 1936, Takahashi would be assassinated by right-wing officers determined to seize control of Japan's future. His death would mark the end of Japan's experimentation with democracy and the beginning of its descent into fascism. 2 unlikely bankers, one Japanese and one Jewish American, came to reshape the balance of global power, an endeavor not done with bullets or bayonets. but with gold, bonds, and an understanding that wars are not won on the battlefield, but in the quiet corners of finance. As it turns out, the fate of even empires can hang on something as simple as a signature on a check. It's wild when you think about it that behind Japan's stunning victory over Russia, its rise to great power, and even the fall of the Tsar, stood financiers who most people had never even heard of. While generals make headlines, it was two bankers and a chance meeting who quietly tilted the world order. Now, if you've made it this far, drop a $sign in the comments and let me know what you think about this war. How do you think that history would have turned out differently if these two people had never met? Also, who do you think is more important in wars, the army generals or the bankers? Also, do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and like the video. And also, if you haven't already, check out this video that I made about the Wallenbergs. It's very interesting. I think you'll really enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching, and always remember, real power is often invisible.